Hello, welcome to my channel, or welcome back if you've been here before. My name is Beth Ann, and today I want to talk about two nonfiction books that I finished pretty recently. One I read on Audible, and that's The Feather Detective. Hopefully I'll remember to put a photo of the cover up here. And then the second one is The Lives of Bees by Thomas Seeley. So I want to talk about The Feather Detective first. Which I really enjoyed, but I will include the caveat that I listened to it on audio, like I said, and I always am a little uncertain about sort of accurately judging like the quality of the writing when I listen to a book on audio, because the narrator is usually so convincing. And so I really enjoyed the experience of listening to this book, but I will say that the two other people in the book club for which I read this book, they thought that there was something about like the tone of the writing that didn't quite like sweep them away, so they didn't enjoy it as much as I did, just from kind of that standpoint, something about the tone of the writing. I will say that even in audio, it does have sort of like a journalistic tone, and I think the author, Chris Sweeney, if I'm remembering correctly, I think the author is a journalist, and so it has a little bit more of that sort of reporting profile piece sort of aspect to it, rather than something more like a biography or a memoir, which I think was a little bit certainly what I was expecting going into it. But then I didn't experience any disconnect because the audio narrator was really good, and so that just kind of blew me away. But all of that to say, I did really enjoy this book. And it's just absolutely fascinating. It follows the career of a woman named Roxy Laybourne, who was really active from like the 1940s until the turn of the century, working primarily for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but actually sitting in the Smithsonian Natural History Museum in their bird collection. And she was the foremost expert, like by far, on the microstructures of bird feathers, and in particular being able to put any feather under a microscope and be able to tell, based on these microscopic structural differences, what bird species it was. And she had access to an amazing reference collection with the bird specimens at the Smithsonian Natural History Museum. But then to be able to apply like this super rigorous scientific approach to developing essentially a process and a methodology to be able to then identify all these birds to species just from like fragments of a feather. I mean, absolutely fascinating from a scientific standpoint. And then her research, her work had all kinds of applications. And that's really what most of her career was the applied applications of this. So once air travel was really taking off in the middle of the 20th century, and bird strikes by airplanes were becoming more and more of a problem as airplanes were flying faster and there were more and more airports. Airports were expanding. And so throughout her career, she would get sent all of these bird pieces, basically, from any time a plane collided with a bird, and she would identify what the bird species were, which then let airports like make management recommendations to figure out, well, how do they make the airport less attractive to birds? Basically, how do they manage the risk of these bird strikes? And even things like adapting flight schedules and flight paths to avoid places where they would expect birds to be like in higher abundance based on migration and things like that. Which also pushed sort of like basic bird research forward as well, because through her work, we were getting all of these data about where birds were like in the air column, and, you know, surprising facts about how high they could actually fly and things like that we didn't know beforehand. So she was doing that for the FAA and for the Air Force, you know, anybody who wanted to figure out where and when and why airplanes were colliding with birds. And then she was also involved with the FBI for a number of years, where they would consult with her, usually in murder cases, where there were feathers at the crime scene, and they would want to know what the feathers were. Could they have come from the murder weapon, if the putative murder weapon was like a pillow that somebody used to suffocate somebody? So I think that was like a 10-year period of her life or something that she was doing these like criminal cases, and she'd go up on the stand as an expert witness to talk about her feather identification. So just absolutely fascinating. It's interesting because she was a very private person, and that is noted in the book, but then it also comes through throughout the whole thing. I mean, you don't really know like who Roxy was as a person, except through what other people have to say about her. Like she was very clammed up and wasn't really talking a lot about her personal life and like her feelings and her experiences. So it definitely doesn't get into that level of like a personal narrative, which I thought was really interesting, and I think kind of just contributes to that like journalistic profile piece sense of the writing, because you don't really get to know her as a person. You really just get to know her career. But that's fine. That's a choice, and certainly don't fault her for that at all. Anyway, it was just a really fascinating account of one woman's career and professional life that I'd never even thought of. Like the idea that people could identify feathers under a microscope to species just like absolutely blows my mind. So I enjoyed that read. The second book that I read is The Lives of Bees by Thomas Seeley. The subtitle is The Untold Story of the Honeybee in the Wild. And Thomas Seeley is a professor at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, and he's really dedicated a lot of his career to studying wild honeybees in the United States, but also in other places around the world. And it's important to note that in the United States, honeybees are not a native species. They were brought here as domesticated colonies to help pollinate crop plants by European colonizers. But since coming over for that agricultural production, a lot of bees have escaped. They've gone feral. And so we do have wild honeybee colonies surviving in throughout much of the United States. And this book talks a lot about Seeley's like long-term studies of wild bee colonies around Ithaca, New York, as well as in other parts of the world, other parts of the country. And it was just absolutely fascinating because a lot of what we think we know about honeybees comes from studying them in this very artificial setting of these, hive boxes that you see as you drive along the highway or whatever, which are cavities that are much larger than what they would naturally seek out for themselves in wild circumstances. They're also at much higher density than honeybee colonies exist in the wild. Which has major ramifications for things like disease transfer, which is one of the major issues with colony collapses today. And so Seeley just talks about in this book his quest to study wild colonies and to answer questions like that. What is the natural density at which they prefer to occur in the wild? What is the ideal cavity size that they prefer when they're searching for nest sites in the wild? Even minutia, like how large do they typically want the actual entrance to their nest to be in the wild, and where do they want that entrance to actually be located in reference to the main volume of the cavity that they're nesting in. And all of these things are different than what we make the honeybees go through in commercial beekeeping hives. So it was just absolutely fascinating, and he rather mildly makes the argument that some of what we struggle with commercial beekeeping is because we've very deliberately made honeybees live in a situation and in infrastructure that is different from the types of living spaces that they would naturally choose for themselves if left alone in the wild, which I find just absolutely fascinating. This was a very sciencey book, so there's a lot of graphs throughout, and he goes in pretty great detail into some of the statistics and sample sizes and things like that. In some of the studies that he has done. But that said, I do think it is probably really accessible, even to a non-scientist. You just have to be pretty interested, I think, in the subject matter and interested in like really seeing the evidence and being convinced about his conclusions about some of those points. But yeah, really well written. There's some great photos, and just a really wonderful legacy, I would say, of decades of research into just really uncovering what honeybees do when they're living in the wild, which is really useful context to put next to what we know about and what our concerns and our challenges are for dealing with managed honeybees that are in these commercial beekeeping operations. So fascinating read. This is one that's going to live on my bookshelves because I do want to have access to some of those points of information. Like I do want to have access to things like what's the average cavity size that they look for in the wild, and what's the average colony density when they're living in the wild. Things like that are just really helpful for me to kind of be able to look up and have in the back of my brain. So those are my two nonfiction reads lately, both really interesting and really enjoyable for kind of different reasons and different purposes. But I would recommend either of them if either of them sounds like it would float your boat. So what nonfiction have you been reading recently? Drop me a recommendation down in the comments, and I will see you all in the next video. Thanks. Bye.